is real. Listen.
Hi, I'm Traci.
And I'm Kathy.
And this is Curious Explorers. Hey, Kath.
Hey, Trace.
How's it going?
It's going. It's freezing.
Oh my God.
I know I bring that up every time we talk now, but it's going well, other than the tundra that we're in.
Only the Yeti and my neighbor's Great Pyrenees dogs are enjoying this weather.
Yeah, it's and I'm not a person. I like the winter. I'm always a person that I like it when it gets dark early. I like all of that stuff. But even I'm like, that's enough. You know,
it's a little much.
Cold. Yeah, it's plenty cold.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you 100%. I had an idea. I just want to get, my brain's always like ping-ponging all over, and more so lately. I have an idea for something. If we do any events, if anybody asks us to do an additional live event, I know you're like, please, no more live events. I already do them for the store and the museum, but
I like live events.
All right. I was thinking maybe there's some way to do like ghostly karaoke or like
ghostly okie.
Yeah. Oh my, that's perfect.
Trademarked.
Don't anybody steal it. Ghostly okie. I love it. Make stickers or t-shirts or something. But yeah, but you can only have songs that somehow connect even very loosely to the theme.
Right.
So whether it's witchcraft or ghosts or,
That's fun. My standard karaoke song is Bad Moon Rising.
Oh,
so
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Bad Moon Rising.
Maybe
I will say you have heard me sing it because I used to sing it at my Halloween party all the time.
I might have had too many Halloween cocktails. I don't know.
Might have too many birthday cake
birthday cake vodka. That's a whole other story.
Yeah.
You have to become a Patreon member to get the story.
Exactly. And then you'll learn about that
and
that
many
interesting
other
day.
Dark and spooky stories. But without further ado, I know that you have a topic that you want to go over, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing it.
So I decided to actually do something that we've talked about a couple of times. I decided, and so this is kind of a throwback to something that one of the cases that we did not too long ago. But I mentioned this case, and because I seem to be on this like historical paranormal binge, and to be honest with you, I love talking about the kind of old school cases and the stuff that has stuck around and is tried and true, because I think that these are cases that existed prior to kind of AI and prior to the internet, and that doesn't mean that they're more valid, but it does mean that they've already kind of stood the test of time, and they're still around and they're still interesting, and there's a bunch of them that I think a lot of paranormalists have cut their teeth on them. And so I can remember this case as being something that I read about in Fate magazine. It was an old case when I was just getting into the paranormal, so it's ancient. But it is a case that I still think bears looking into. I think that it's something that if you are a new paranormalist, or if you're a paranormalist that came up kind of in the Ghost Hunters TV age, it's worth going back and taking a look at. Course,
I'm dying to know what the case is.
So
I have no idea.
Of course, is the Patience Worth case.
Okay.
And we mentioned it when we were talking about reincarnation and kind of past lives. And so I kept dropping hints about it. So I thought we would jump into that, and it's a fun conversation, but it's also something that has a lot of historical data for people to go back and do their own research on. So without further ado, the Patience Worth case is, I would say, one of the most intriguing and debated cases in the history of the paranormal, and in, I would say, spiritual communication. So it centers around the claims of a medium, or she's a woman who ended up having mediumistic abilities, who believed that she channeled the spirit of a 17th century woman named Patience Worth. And the case has captivated researchers for decades. It's also captivated skeptics and just kind of casual enthusiasts. It we're looking to provide a kind of comprehensive exploration into the Patience Worth case, talk about its origins, key events in it, and the implications for kind of what it means to paranormalists and our understanding of how spiritual communication works, what it means, and how mediumship impacts our understanding of the greater world. So let's talk about the life of Pearl Curran, or Curran. So the story of Patience Worth starts with Pearl Curran, a St. Louis housewife. She's an amateur writer, and she became one of the most famous spiritual mediums in the early 20th century. She was born in 1883. She was known for her involvement in spiritualism, which was a movement that gained popularity in the late 19th century and continued into the early 20th century. Being born in 1883, she was kind of right in the middle of that there. So in 1843, you had the Fox sisters who kind of created the spiritualist movement. 1863, you have this big movement into spiritualism again because of the Civil War. So she's born at a time when spiritualism had its second resurgence and was still pretty popular. So she is, she's growing up when spiritualism is very, very common. It's not necessarily followed, but it's very common. She would have heard about it a lot. And spiritualism focuses on the belief that communication with the spirits of the deceased is possible and likely, particularly using mediums. That is, people who have unique gifts that are able to communicate with people who have passed over. Her mediumship began in 1913 so she's 30 years old, when she and her husband, who were both interested in spiritualism, decided to hold a seance. That's how a lot of people did it. During one of these sessions, Curran began to channel a spirit who identified herself as Patience Worth. According to Curran, Patience Worth was a woman who lived in the 17th century and had a profound interest in literature and the arts. That's interesting in and of itself.
Right.
So 1913 is also interesting because World War I is kind of just about to start. So you have a lot of geopolitical things happening. And spiritualism is going to hit its heights again in about another 3 or 4 years. So the world is poised for the Great One, or the Great War. Unfortunately, we had to name it World War I because we've had more than one.
Right.
But it's a time when spiritualism is kind of becoming popular again. So the initial communication starts with automatic writing. Automatic writing is where a medium writes messages purportedly from a spirit without conscious control. So you either have your arm in a sling, you ask a question and your arm moves unrelated to you, or it's also can be called non-dominant handwriting. So you put the pen in, if you're right-handed, you put the pen in the left hand, you ask questions, and your left hand is supposedly controlled by a spirit, and you get answers using that. And automatic writing was a very popular way of doing it. Now, she began to receive messages from Patience Worth, who claimed to be a literary figure, or she claimed to be a writer with a rich vocabulary and a deep understanding of language and literature. And again, that would be unusual for a woman in this late 17th century, but not unheard of. Patience Worth's communications were characterized by their literary quality and historical accuracy, which intrigued and puzzled both Curran and those who learned about the case. So like we said, a woman. Now, there are reasons why that could be the case, right? So she lived in the 17th century, but she's existed since the 17th century. So in other words, just because her birth took place in the 17th century doesn't mean that she hasn't experienced understanding and learning since her death.
That's such a great point, because I don't think we ever think about that when people think of tapping into spirits.
Because remember, she is not being reborn. This is not a case of past life. This is not a case of reincarnation. This is a case of spirit communication.
Channel.
That's a big difference, right? So her communications were characterized by literacy, and she had a flair for it too. Her messages were often very poetic, and they were detailed, and they suggested a level of literary sophistication that was unexpected for a medium with no formal literary training. So the idea that Pearl Curran, even if she's an educated person, she didn't have a master's degree in literature. So it would be unusual for if it was unusual for a woman from the 17th century, it was at a level that was unusual for a woman of Pearl Curran's education and background. So she starts producing literary works, and they do this in tandem with each other. So one of the most significant aspects of the Patience Worth case was the literary works that Curran, under the guidance of Patience Worth, produced. And these works included poetry, novels, plays, all which have been published and attributed to Patience Worth. Some of the most notable works include, and I would suggest going ahead and looking at some of these. At least one of them is actually worth a read. And so the first one was called, or the most famous one is called The Sorry Tale, which is a historical novel set in the time of Christ, which received considerable attention for its detailed historical and cultural descriptions. The novel was first published in 1924 and was praised for its depth and authenticity. So, and when it was published, not everybody that reviewed it knew not everybody knew that it was published through a medium. The other one was The Pot Upon the Wheel, a novel published in 1929, which further kind of showcased Patience Worth's literary style and historical knowledge. And she had poetry and plays, which were attributed to Worth, demonstrating a lot of versatility. The works were often praised for their literary quality and historical accuracy, leading some to question whether they could have been produced solely by Curran's unconscious mind. So in other words, these were so good and so accurate and so in-depth that people were like, could someone just produce this subconsciously?
And remember, no internet at the time.
No internet. So, but there is no question that she was. I think there's a certain bias that you see here across the board saying, wow, a housewife of this woman's, education level could not possibly have produced this content. I don't know that that's necessarily true. There's lots of really smart people out there who could go and read a book and do historical, everybody who was doing historical research was doing it in the same way. So, I mean, there is a certain biases that's there that's essentially saying a woman, a 33-year-old housewife from St. Louis couldn't possibly be intelligent enough to produce this. And I don't know that we would make that statement today.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking the likelihood that she would have access to all of this information.
Well, we don't know what the information was. I mean, like I'm just saying, I'm not making the case against Patience Worth. I am, however, saying the biases against a woman being, a housewife being able to produce this by going in and reading, things that were readily, Mort Darther or something that were readily available in a local library. I think kind of worked it worked for Patience Worth and against Pearl Curran that, the bar was set low, thinking that she might not be capable of doing it. And I think that was probably a certain amount of, classism and misogyny, and maybe it would be the only way, maybe Patience Worth was the only way that Pearl Curran would be allowed. So according to Patience Worth herself, she was a 17th century woman who was born in England and lived during a time of great social and political change, which it was. She claimed to have been a member of a Puritan family and expressed a deep interest in literature and the arts. Her descriptions of life and the time that she lived in were detailed and consistent with historical records, which added to the intrigue surrounding the case. She often spoke of her experiences and observations with a sense of nostalgia and longing, providing a vivid portrayal of her life in the past. The Patience Worth case attracted considerable public and critical attention. The literary works produced under Patience Worth's names were reviewed by critics and scholars who were often impressed by their quality. However, the case also faced skepticism and criticism for those who questioned the authenticity of the communications and the possibility of unconscious authorship. So, and to me, that's an interesting question from a from a critical perspective, like as a literary critic, what do you care? You know what I mean? If your assignment is to give a critical analysis of the validity or the authenticity and value of the work, what do you care? Like should its authorship enter into your criticism at all? You're not qualified to say whether or not there's a spirit had any cause in it. So the idea that people would say, well, it's good. Well, wait a second. You're saying a ghost did this? Oh, then it's not good. You know, it just seems to me kind of silly. So the Patience Worth case was obviously, skeptics came at it, right? People were hitting it pretty hard. And by the time she was producing this stuff in the 20s, there had already been a big movement in spiritualism, and then a backlash in spiritualism. So, and you had lots of critics that were offering different explanations for the phenomena. And some of those include, and these came up in our discussion when we were talking about past lives and whatnot, cryptomnesia, the concept that refers to phenomena where a person unconsciously recalls information that they've previously encountered, but believes it to be original. In other words, she read all of this stuff someplace and was piecing it together. And you know, it does happen. You know, it does happen. I'm not sure it usually happens to the degree that you're producing great works of art. Then again, ghosts don't produce great works of art, according to some of the critics. Unconscious creativity, another explanation, is that she was a great writer. She was a good writer that didn't have the confidence to do this in her own name, and so her mind generated the works without her conscious awareness. And essentially, she pieced together this. She was just a talented writer who was not able to acknowledge or recognize that in herself, and used this subconscious creation to allow her to do it. Several researchers and scholars have investigated the Patience Worth case to determine its validity. And some of the areas of research include a comparative analysis, where researchers compared the literary works attributed to Worth with contemporary literature and historical records to assess their authenticity. And while some findings supported the idea of Patience Worth's literary prowess, others suggested that the works might have been influenced by Curran's own knowledge and experiences, which I still would not say negates the idea that she got that stuff mediumistically. Because like we said, it's not always a direct, it's not like a phone call. And then there were psychological studies that explored the possibility of unconscious processes and the role of the subconscious mind in producing these creative works. And these studies have contributed to understanding the potential mechanisms behind the Patience Worth phenomena. So, you know, I mean, in other words, there were people who looked into this and said, well, maybe this phenomena existed, again, because she wasn't able to fully acknowledge her own creativity or didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so started to create this. Her belief in mediumship and her belief in spiritualism allowed her an outlet. So the case itself has broader implications in understanding mediumship and spiritual communications. And it does kind of really dig into the complex nature of the relationship between the medium and the spirit. Maybe there's something that it might be more of a collaboration than a direct communication.
Well, that's an interesting point. I hadn't even really thought about it. And that wasn't even a possibility I was really thinking about, but right. How interesting.
And I do think that that's important to think about when we think about mediumship, where, and listen, I know skeptics, or skeptics probably, with an S.
They're probably not really investing a lot in this channel. We'd have to be awfully huge for them to be doing that.
To be skeptical as well, though, but I do think that, there's very little gray area when it comes to a lot of skeptical thinking. And I think a lot of times the interesting things in life are in the gray area, where you have to pick out the threads and not just be like, nope, I understand it all because it could be this, it must be this. And look at something and say, you know what, there's stuff in there that your skepticism is also not explaining. And it doesn't mean I'm right. but it doesn't mean you're right either. So the case raised a lot of questions about mediumship, even to people who believe in mediumship. And we're talking about it because we started talking about past lives and we started talking about reincarnation. And I don't think that it necessarily is truly that, but it does kind of leans into it. And it's kind of contributed to the broader debate about reincarnation and the possibility of life beyond death. It's also this interesting idea that someone's been sitting around, when we think about mediumship, we almost always think about our own loved ones or the people that we're trying to connect with. We don't think that there's just some layperson out there who's like, wait a second, I've been here for 500 years and I've been dying to talk to you about this.
It's been really boring.
Yeah. Like I've been waiting for this perfect person. And so it's kind of interesting that would happen, and so you start thinking, well, what was it about this person that, I'm sure there were other people in St. Louis that were, doing this. But the interesting thing about this is there are fully realized works of literature, and some of which, have actually been declared to have certain merit. They are dated. They're hard. It's kind of like Ivanhoe or something more Darther, where you're going to read them in a more literary thing. And I think if they had been produced exclusively by a living person, they might not still be in publication, because they do come across as dated. They are written in a dialect and tone that is very reminiscent of the 17th and 18th centuries. So they're hard. They're hard to slog through. And I think in some of Patience-Worth's stuff, and if you go and you read some of the correspondence, she writes it using like the dialect. So she writes it phonetically. So it's very interesting. And I think that's an interesting thing. The Patience-Worth case has also obviously influenced subsequent cases of spiritual communication. It's also contributed to the development of theories and practices related to mediumship and spiritual communication, and to a certain degree psychology as well, because there are people who will look at this from a purely psychological, meaning that the writing happened. It's just which part of the mind, was it the mind communicating with another mind, or was it the subconscious mind that produced it? She continued, meaning Pearl Curran, continued to produce works under the name of Patience-Worth until she died. So if she produced it, but she did it unconsciously, right? That's interesting in and of itself.
Oh, yeah.
If she produced it consciously and then elected to attribute it to this other, identity, that's interesting in and of itself. And if she produced it or purely as a tool of another intellect or intelligence, that's interesting. So no matter how you look at this case, it's worthy of conversation. It's an interesting case.
It is a really interesting case. And, of course, as usual, I'm having a million different thoughts about it. Because I'm even thinking, let's just take Patience-Worth and set the case to the side for a whisper of a second. If we give somebody a creative writing exercise and we ask them to imagine channeling their favorite writer, or just another, their alter ego or their higher self, or, whatever, people will write differently, or at least more freely.
Right.
There's so many aspects of us that are below the level of conscious awareness. I'm especially thinking a woman in that era would have a hard time being free to do a lot.
Yep.
So to be this creative, especially, to me, it never really matters whether it's paranormal or just some aspect of ourselves that's expressed differently, which is kind of amazing and wonderful in and of itself. Do I think people can connect with spirits of people who have passed on? Absolutely. Do I think sometimes they're strangers and not connected to us? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If everything I've heard about people who passed on is true, 500 years isn't really that much time for them. And who knows if Patience-Worth had been communicating through other people as well, and maybe just stuff hadn't been attributed to her. But yeah, to me, I kind of feel like for the sake of the writing, I know that's not what everybody else is going to say, but it almost doesn't matter because the story came through.
Right.
The other thing I was thinking is just, now that the author has passed, the living author has passed. So now you have two departed people. Somebody could try and connect with her.
Mm-hmm.
And just be like, listen, was this you?
I think too, I think ultimately she started using a Ouija board. Because if I remember correctly, I'm remembering an interview with her, I think it was in Life magazine, and they have her with the Ouija board. So she had which is an arduous way of writing a book. And especially when you realize that, like, these books were 700-800 pages long.
Good
These were
Lord.
not like, these were not brief little narratives. They were deep, long. One of the books I think took place in like the Middle Ages, and it was, I kept saying Mort Darthur or Ivanhoe or something, because that's the one I remember actually reading, was really, really very complex like that, like a, Chaucer or something. So it's not like this was an EVP or, electronic voice phenomena where a voice was this was something that was arduously received. I mean, imagine writing,
a page like that would be torturous.
Yeah, and in a dialect that's not your natural dialect. So it's really interesting across the board. I do think that it's an interesting case because it was published. I think it's an interesting case because it continued to be, looked at as a paranormal case. There was also a couple of other mediums right around the same time and there's a woman, and her name escapes me, and I'm gonna have to look it up. But she started writing music, and she had no training in writing music. There was no record of her understanding how to play an instrument. She could not sight read, and she started writing music as Mozart and I think Beethoven. And there were a couple of critics who were like, this, if you had told me that Beethoven or Mozart, excuse me, had written this, I would not have been surprised. That the writing that came through was very similar to, and this was a person that had no education. And I would argue that that's a little bit more. Someone can be a naturally good storyteller and read books from the library by themselves. But if you don't play an instrument and you don't read music and it would seem to me that would be really unusual for you to produce.
Unless she's a savant,
Well, that's it. Right. And that's it. And who's to say then that savants aren't communicating? Like going down different roads with it.
It's another good point.
It's and I did think that, like, to me, this is one of those cases. And again, one of the reasons why was there was no one suggested that this was plagiarism. No one said, you know what, she went into the library and she found this book no one had ever heard of. No one has any understanding how she was capable of writing it. Maybe that's underestimating her. But this woman that doesn't seem to have had the education to have her write this work.
I don't think anybody would think of it as typical. Although I'm kind of wondering if it happens more often than we realize when people think of their muse or think of their, their guides or their, or they feel inspired.
And they're not attributing it to that.
Inspired, like spirit.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, who knows? I'm just thinking also of more modern day kind of examples like Conversations with God, supposedly a channeled work, right? I mean, Paul Selig, who, God, I'm forgetting the names of his books. I actually had a reading with Paul Selig years ago, and it was just a wild experience because not only does he say things that are coming from his guides, and it's very specifically not coming from him,
right?
But he's written his books that way. He'll tell you that the guides write the books,
but the difference is that those are not literary books.
That's true.
That's true. So they're not works of fiction. They're not works of creativity. They're works where someone is specifically talking about the subject that we're talking about, right? Yeah. So they're talking about they're talking about spiritualism. They're talking about the continuity of life after death. They're talking about kind of the greater discussions of we call it paranormal. They're not saying, hey, I wrote this really catchy tune. or like, hey, I think you're really going to dig this, I mean, and to me, that's one of the reasons why this is so unique, because this is a spirit that's coming through and saying, hey, I don't have any big news about the other side. That's
Let's
not what's
just
of
write
interest to me.
together. Let's just write something.
Yeah, but I have this great story I want to tell you. I can't write it myself, so we're going to write it together.
So before I forget, I just want to touch on something you very obliquely refer to very early in this episode. And I believe you were talking about dissociative identity disorder, aka the, multiple personality disorder. And the thing is, what I know about it is that, the alters, the different personalities have different talents. They have different proclivities. They have different, completely different inner worlds. And that is another possibility that Patience Worth is a split off part of Pearl Curran or Curran. I'm not saying that's what it is, but I'm not, I don't know. And I'm open to very open to the idea of channeling. Listen, so I don't really know.
I think it's entirely possible. It would be an incredibly realized personality, and is there a way for it to be a little bit of everything? And maybe there's a lot of spices in the recipe.
Absolutely. You know what I mean? This is just my normally, my brain is so tangential, especially these days. The older I get, the more it goes into all these offshoots. But I'm thinking of two kind of pop culture things. But one, you were talking before about people feeling like somebody else is writing the music through them, or the literature.
That the whole concept of a muse.
Tell me, I hope people tell me if I get this wrong, because it's not my area of expertise, but was it Jimmy Page or Robert Plant, or who was it who supposedly made a deal with the devil to become
that's
famous?
The Crossroads. That's I can't remember. Yeah.
Who supposedly, there are quite a lot of celebrities that.
But this is famous.
I don't believe that's actually true.
And he wrote Hellhound Blues. I mean, he was a blues guitarist.
You're thinking of somebody else, because there's more than one. There is the famous but less famous blues guitarist, because you have to know that genre of music, but also like a relatively, a 20th century rock band that supposedly did a deal with the devil. Who knows? But also, I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show Evil, which I really hope they renew. I guess Netflix picked it up.
Sadly, I don't think they are. You and I have discussed this. It's kind of our lives,
But Dr. Kurt, I forget his last name. Scary. Senior moment. But
yeah. I know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm.
But supposedly he invited a demon to inspire him. Like, did Kurt write the book? Did the demon write the book?
Makes
I don't know.
Too, like in The Shining. Do you remember The Shining?
Yes.
Well, the movie, not the book.
Work and no play makes Jack.
Yeah, and he thought he was writing a whole, in his mind, he was writing an entire opus. And then when he went, when she went and looked at it, he had just been writing those words over and over and
Red
over.
Room.
I don't know. And who was it? I mean, there's lots of like stories of people making deals for greatness, and sometimes the greatness is in an avenue of creativity. So I think there's lots of people who said, I'm trying to think of who's the great violinist. But these were people who could not possibly, like, their skill so transcended, like human ability or human limitations, that there had to have been something infernal, certainly not divine. It's never divine. It's not like, I made a deal with God.
By the way, not to insult any contemporary, incredibly talented people that I'm just like, coming up with names. And I'm curious if people, maybe this is a good kind of final thought to leave people with, or a question to ask rather, but I'm wondering how many people have felt like they have channeled something beyond themselves in a time either when they just wanted to do something or in a time of need. So I'm thinking you're going to take an exam and you feel like, oh my God, I don't know how I'm going to do this. So it's like you're inviting in, whether it's your guides.
Jesus, take the wheel.
Yeah. or, your muse, or you're imagining channeling a famous person who you think could do it. It's a psychological device, but could it also be something else? So I'm wondering whether it's writing or taking an exam or composing music or playing a sport, even like where it's like, oh, I can't do it, but maybe so and so could. And can I channel a bit of them? We use that term kind of colloquially and casually, but is it more than that?
Or this
I don't
whole,
know.
like, I got into a groove, or I was in the zone, and what does that mean to you? Because I mean, listen, I can tell you that there have been times when I sat down to write, not recently, but when I was actively writing a lot more, where I would sit down to write and, 15, 20 pages later, where you're like, where did those 5 hours go?
Absolutely.
And it's, you're not on autopilot, but it does feel like you're a co-pilot. And you have to have done that. I mean,
my dissertation, but I also kind of hypnotized myself to feel like I would get it done. And then I would say, I almost feel like I can't believe that I got it done so rapidly or whatever. And that I would almost feel like I got out of my own way.
Right.
So
I will say, though, I've done creative writing where I've written from different characters' perspectives, where I was just like, wow, I didn't know the character was going to go there. Like, I didn't know they were going to respond that way. And I would say a lot of creative writers will tell you where you're like, that's not who I thought that character was, or that's not who I thought that person was.
I swear this is the last thing I'm going to say. And I keep saying, oh, that's it. But the thing that is popping in my mind, this could be a whole other podcast. I don't even know if it would resonate with people who watch this one or listen to this one, but this is going to sound totally like not connected, but I'm going to connect it. So, the book Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon Hill, is still a bestseller, but there's, he talks a lot throughout the book about, basically self-hypnosis.
Right.
But one of the things is he has his, I'm going to maybe phrase it a little differently, but his kind of inner kind of, I'm going to call it a committee of advisors. I forget how he referred to it, but there's a point in there where he, I think, becomes for a period uncomfortable because, we all populate our minds with different characters who are probably aspects of us and people we know and people we think we know or would like to know, or our imagination. But these characters started coming up with things that he wouldn't have.
Right.
And I mean, the character isn't the right word, but like, if you imagine going to a boardroom and having a table of the best advisors in the world for whatever it was you wanted to do, but they started advising him in such a way that they really did not even feel like parts of him.
Right.
So it's just an interesting phenomenon. And when those parts or those internal characters come up with things that we have no conscious awareness of, and maybe no unconscious awareness of, that's something impossible to assess, right? But that, no exposure to something that they bring in that turns out to be true or helpful. That's either exciting or eerie, depending on depending on where you're coming from.
Right.
But who's to say that's not channeling? I interviewed Helene Wabe, who's the research director of IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, a few years ago on my other podcast. And her whole thing is channeling, and she studies this. So we could even do an episode on channeling and the present day research on it, if people are interested. But it's fascinating. It's fascinating to think of writing. I probably need to tap into my own patience worth just to get more work done.
Yeah. Maybe if patience is available, if patience is available to do a little bit of, ad hoc. The per diem is not great.
The per diem muse.
Exactly.
Hourly rate.
I'm going to tell you, though, if you guys are out, make sure you go check it out, because it's just, it's just interesting. And I would also say that if you are a writer and, you're doing this kind of subconscious stuff, and let's say it was subconscious, she could have picked an easier,
my God,
era to delve into. You're not, being a Puritan and then to make the case of being a literary, a Puritan woman interested in literature and the arts, that's a tough case to make. but she seems to manage to do it. So just go read it. Read some of the poetry. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. Well, as always, I'm going to invite our listeners to let us know what you think. Please share your experiences and stories. If Zelda is, of course, shaking at the appropriate time.
It's usually my guys.
I know. At least she's not yet barking, but that's coming. But let us know what you think. Share some of your experiences. Do you channel? Have you channeled? Do you know what we mean by tapping into that muse or, other aspect of yourself, or who knows? But of course, as always, until next time, stay curious.
Keep exploring.
Bye for now.
Bye, guys.
I know that the paranormal is real. Listen.
You've just listened to the Curious Explorers podcast with the Kathy Kelly and Traci Stein. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. And of course, until next time, stay curious.
It is real.